Morning, friends. Thank you, Paul. I'm glad to hear that you're my friend. Jesus was a friend of sinners, so you're following a good example. However, if you're trying to start a new tradition here, that people who come and stand at the front have to show their bald spot to the camera, let me tell you that I ain't going to play that game. It will become obvious enough to you in time without needing particular camera attention. Now, look, I really do not want to be gratuitously, sort of needlessly controversial, but I do kind of feel that on this particular day, when our focus is where it is, but if ever there is a service where it might be appropriate to have a woman speak, this could possibly be the one. But I know I'll try and get over the handicap of just being a bloke, and I'll do the best that I can. I Googled, I looked online to try and find out what the origin of Mother's Day was. Some of you may have done that. It isn't actually as easy to pin down precisely as you might think. But back in the 1900s, the early 1900s, an American woman called Anna Jarvis started having a memorial service for her mother on the same day each year. And the idea just seemed to catch on. And in 1914, the American president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, actually finally declared one day, Mother's Day, as a national holiday. Incidentally, later on, Anna Jarvis, who started the whole thing off, became a vigorous campaigner to get the whole thing finished, because she hated the way it had been taken over by commercial interests. We might have some sympathy with that. And if you're not entirely fed up with the history of Mother's Day, let me tell you that in the 1500s, so a long, long time ago, in this country, the church designated one day a year as Mothering Sunday, although probably the focus was more on Mother Church than it was on human mothers. So it goes back a long way. And traditions are like that, aren't they? They get started and they get built on and added to, and then years later, the tradition continues, but no one's really quite sure why. And forgive me if you've heard me say this before, but it reminded me when I thought about that of the husband newlywed, and he noticed with real interest the first few weeks of his marriage that every time his wife cooked a joint of beef, before she put it in the oven, she cut a couple of inches very carefully off the end and put that to one side. Eventually, he was puzzled enough. He went to her mother and he said, look, my wife does this, every time. And when I asked her why, she said, because that's how you do it. So why did you do it? She said, yes, that's right. I cut a couple of inches off like that. I've always done it that way. So he went to his wife's grandmother and he said, look, this has been going on and I'm wondering, where did it begin? Why did you do it? She said, well, when we got married, we were very poor. We only had a very small oven. And so the only way I could get the joint in was to cut a couple of inches off. See, that's how things start, isn't it? And then they get a strength and a life all of their own. Perhaps there's a little lesson for us there about traditions. I will say this, I do have tremendous respect for mothers. I admire them. I've seen 3 children being born. My own, don't really think I sort of lurk around the maternity ward just trying to get a peek anywhere I can. I've seen 3 children being born, and I have enormous admiration for anybody who's prepared to go through that even once, let alone more than once. Any idea that we have that men are tougher than women, if you really think that, just get yourself along to a labour suite. You'll soon be inclined to change your mind. Well, I'm going to focus today on a mother whose story is told to us in the Old Testament part of the Bible. This mother lived probably about 300 years ago in the land of Israel, and her story is in the first book of Samuel, which seems an appropriate place for it, given who she was. So 1 Samuel and chapter 1, I'm going to read. I think I'm going to actually read quite quickly through the entire chapter. Don't be too dispirited. It's only 20 verses long, and it gives us a big picture. And then if we understand the big sweep of what's going on, I won't need to speak so long in explaining and joining up the dots. Here it is, 1 Samuel and chapter 1. There was a certain man from Ramathaim, a Zuphite from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was, now here's the interesting thing. I went online to try and find out, how do you say this man's name? Is it Elkanah or Elkanah? Well, basically you pays your money and you takes your choice, because the experts, the Hebrew experts online tell you both. So I'm going to call him Elkanah, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. Now, just let me underline this. At night, the last thing I do before I try and drop off to sleep is read. Not something that's going to kind of stir me up or make me think or provoke me, just something to settle me down. And at the moment, I'm rereading the books which I came to love when I was much, much younger, the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. Just brilliant stuff, you know. And but Narnia was a land that existed solely in the imagination of C.S. Lewis. And all the characters that he writes about are unreal. It's a work of fiction. The Bible is not a work of fiction. It is a work of history. And the events we're reading about happened to real people at a real time in human history and in a real place, in this case, in the land of Israel. All right, now I'm going to pick up the reading again, partway through verse 2. He had 2 wives. One was called Hannah. She's the heroine of our story today. One was called Hannah and the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. Year after year, verse 3, year after year, this man went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh, where Hophni and Phinehas, the 2 sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord. Whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah, he gave a double portion because he loved her, and the Lord had closed her womb. And because the Lord had closed her womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. And this went on year after year. And whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. Elkanah, her husband, would say to her, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? After all, don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? Do you get that? Hannah, come on, what you got to be miserable about? You've got me. Verse 9, once when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on a chair by the doorpost of the Lord's temple. In bitterness of soul, Hannah wept much and prayed to the Lord, and she made a vow, saying, O Lord Almighty, if you will only look upon your servant's misery and remember me and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. It's an indication that he would be totally dedicated to God. As she kept on praying to the Lord, verse 12, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk and said to her, how long will you keep on getting drunk? Get rid of your wine. Not so, Lord, Hannah replied. I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. Well, that told him, didn't it? And good job too. Particularly given that he was in the process of entirely disqualifying himself to serve as a priest in Israel. Funny that when people are failing in their own lives, morally, secretly, spiritually, They tend to become swift and harsh judges of other people. Eli answered, verse 17, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him." She said, "May your servant find favor in your eyes." Then she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Early the next morning, they arose and worshipped before the Lord, and then went back to their home at Ramah. Elkanah lay with Hannah, his wife, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time, Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son, and she named him Samuel, saying, "Because I asked the Lord for him." When the man Elkanah went up with all his family to offer the annual sacrifice to the Lord and to fulfill his vow, Hannah did not go. She said to her husband, "After the boy is weaned, I will take him and present him before the Lord, and he will live there always." "You do what seems best to you, Elkanah," her husband told her. "Stay here till you have weaned him. Only may the Lord make good his word." So the woman stayed at home and nursed her son until she had weaned him. And when he was weaned, she took the boy with her, young as he was, along with a 3-year-old bull, some flour, wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. When they had slaughtered the bull, they brought the boy to Eli, and she said to him, "As surely as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he shall be given over to the Lord." And he, that is Samuel, worshipped the Lord there. So there we are. There's a little family. Elkanah, he was an important man. Hannah had married into a good family. If you look back into Elkanah's background, you find he was directly related to Joseph, he of the multicolored coat fame, and his father Jacob, and right the way back to Joshua. I mean, he was born of a good family. He was an important man. He was, I suspect, quite a prosperous man. He was a spiritual man, a religious man, and within limits, he was a kind and a sensitive man. Because I noticed this, and this is a message. I know it's Mother's Day, but sorry, guys, allow me a message to dads here. I noticed he did not send his wife to worship God. He did not merely let her go. He did not merely not stand in her way. He actually stepped up, took a lead. I wish more men would do that. And set the pace. And that's what Elkanah was like. And he had 2 wives. Now, that was quite common in that time and place. It's still very common in many places around the world now, in Africa and in Asia and probably in Salt Lake City. I don't know, but that's where the Mormons are headquartered, yeah. It's not uncommon, but it's not common in this country. It's not part of our tradition. And by the time the New Testament was written, it had become normal to have 1 wife. And indeed, some words of Jesus are, of course, the text which tells us that we should only have 1 wife. You know those words? "No man can serve 2 masters," said Jesus. So it's good to have just 1. Both wives, Hannah and Peninnah, but only one was a mother. Hannah, as we've read, was childless, whereas Peninnah was a mother many times over. Verse 4 talks about all her sons and daughters. She was having children like it was going out of fashion, whilst poor Hannah couldn't have any. Now, look, in today's society, we do and we should and we must respect and acknowledge people's right to not have children if they choose not to. We must also be sensitive to those who want to, but who cannot. But it was different in Hannah's day. Because Hannah couldn't have a child, a number of consequences flowed from that. First of all, she was disapproved of socially. Secondly, she would have been made to feel as if she'd failed domestically. And thirdly, people would have considered her unworthy spiritually. Those would have been the consequences for Hannah of not having a child. She would have been seen as a domestic failure, as something of a social outcast, and she would have been judged to be a sinful person, because the Bible teaches that children are a gift from God. And that's true. But the people of that time and place went a step beyond that, and they concluded that if God didn't give people children, that was some sort of punishment or judgment from God. So if it wasn't bad enough not having a child, if it wasn't bad enough having Peninnah losing no opportunity to twist the knife in the wound, on top of that, she's considered a social outcast, a domestic failure, and spiritual pond life. Do you get that? No wonder when she prays, she pours out her heart and her grief and her anguish. You know why her lips were moving but no sound coming out? Her prayer was too deep for words. It's coming from her heart. That was her situation. Now, Elkanah was clearly good to both his wives. And we read particularly that he loved Hannah. We don't have to conclude from that. We mustn't conclude from that, but he didn't love Peninnah. But he didn't love Hannah any the less because she couldn't bear him a child. But when all said and done, he was only a man. And there is a revelation here that he didn't really get the depth of hurt and the anguish which Hannah was feeling, because he comes up with his wonderful statement, well, look, you've got me. Aren't I better for you than 10 sons? I know, forgive a personal note, and particularly Rita, forgive a personal note, but when we married, Rita, in those early days particularly, probably still now for all I know, but in those early days particularly, Rita really missed her family. Her mum and her dad and her 2 sisters at their home in Bournemouth. And as a brand new husband, I have to say, I struggled with that. I found that hard sometimes. Because looking back, I guess what I was thinking was, well, look, I don't know why you're feeling lonely or homesick for anybody, because look, the whole package, you got me. But Elkanah, just a man. Now, look, this isn't the main point of this message, but this might be the most important thing I'm going to say in it, actually. Let me tell you this. Things that other people don't get, Jesus gets. Okay, really, things that other people don't understand, Jesus really understands. There's a lovely old song that says, all your anxieties, all your care, bring to the mercy seat, leave it there. Never a burden he will not share, never a friend like Jesus. Bring to the mercy seat all our anxiety, all our fears, all our heartaches, all our guilt, all our regrets, all our confusion, all our disappointment, all our hidden, wounded feelings. If nobody else in the world gets it, Jesus gets it. Bring it to him. Like the old song says, bring it to the mercy seat. I was singing that song to myself while I was preparing this message, and I thought, mercy seat, mercy seat. I need to know more about the mercy seat. And so what I found out, and what many of you already know, is this: that the most precious thing that the Jews had as a nation was it was called the Ark of the Covenant, not to be confused with a boat. The Ark of the Covenant was a wooden box overlaid with gold. It was about 45 inches long and about 27 inches deep. And it had a lid on it. Inside there were kept various precious things, but there was a lid. And on the lid, there were little statues of sort of angelic type beings. And that lid was called the mercy seat. And it was called the mercy seat because the blood of the animal sacrifice that was offered for the sins of the people would be sprinkled on that wooden overlaid with gold lid. It was the place where the priest would shed blood for the sins of the people. It's where God would meet with the priest as the people's representative. And for us, the mercy seat is the cross. We have to come to Jesus, to the cross by faith, with all our anxieties and all our sins. We lay them there. Jesus gets it. All right, well, back to Hannah. I want to point out a number of ways in which Hannah is significant. And the first one is she was a sensible woman. And I'm getting that from this. She did not turn away from God because of her bitterness. She turned toward him. She did not say, God hasn't answered my prayer after all these years. I'm never going to go near the house of God at Shiloh again. I'm never going to offer another sacrifice. I'm never going to say another prayer. I'm never going to sing another psalm. Not that it would have been psalms back then, but you know what I mean. I'm never going to go to church again. I'm done with God. She could have said all that in her grief and in the wounded nature of her spirit. Let me tell you this. Look, you see, she kept going to the house of God despite repeated disappointments. When we are hurting, that is not the time to run from God. That is the time to run toward him, okay? Or to put it another way, don't get out of the train while it's still in the tunnel, okay? Second thing that she did, well, she prayed. She prayed seriously. She prayed sincerely. She prayed persistently. She did not give up on praying year after year. And thirdly, she did not forget about God once the problem was solved. Isn't that significant? I mean, come on, how many times have we done a bit of negotiation with God? And we prayed, and sometimes we've even forgotten to thank him, let alone make good on any of the promises which we made. She didn't do that. She kept her promise. And indeed, as we read on in chapter 2, she really poured out her heart in worship and in thanksgiving. Now, you will have noticed as I was reading, however, that she was misunderstood by Eli the priest. His career was on a serious downturn because of his failure as a father, actually. And he was quick to criticize Hannah. So be warned about that, because people who get serious with God, like Hannah was getting serious with God, are often going to be misunderstood and will often be on the receiving end of all sorts of misunderstanding and criticism, and sometimes even far worse. So Hannah kept her promise, and when the child was weaned, she took him along to the house of the Lord at Shiloh, and she left him there. But yeah, I know, I get it. It all sounds a bit Dickensian and cruel, doesn't it? I mean, most of us aren't even fans of sending kids to civilized English boarding schools. But this was not sending Samuel. This was not taking her son to some radicalizing madrasa. There's no reason to think that Eli and the other people at the house of God at Shiloh would have been cruel or overbearing or unkind. If somebody committed a child of 3 into your care, would you take every opportunity you had to beat it and be unpleasant to it? Or would you try and understand its loneliness and its homesickness? Would you try to make it feel at home? Would you love it? You would, wouldn't you? Well, why would you think that Eli and the others at the house of the Lord would be any different to that? Also, it's interesting to note that Shiloh was only 15 miles away from where Samuel was born, which means it was by no means impossible for him to go home or for them to go to him, holidays, high days. Hannah kept her promise. Eli, you see, was not a cruel man. He was a weak man. That was his problem. And I'm quite sure that they did everything they could to help Samuel to settle into that situation. And she committed or dedicated her son to the Lord. I'll close with this, but somebody once said the best thing that a man can do for his kids, you know what it is? Love their mother. The best thing a man can do for his kids is love their mother. And the best thing that parents can do for their children is point them to the Lord. Dedicate them to the Lord. Pray for them that they will come to know the Lord for themselves, that they will go on to grow. I was so glad we had some of those quotes from people about Mother's Day, because somebody was talking about the good example that their mother had set them, which had helped them come to know the Lord for themselves. We must point our kids to the Lord by example and by teaching and by prayer. And note finally, Eli the priest had failed. His successors, his sons, were hopelessly corrupt. The priesthood itself was falling apart and the nation was leaderless. But someone was going to step up who would restore the priesthood, restore the prophetic ministry, bring the word of God again to Israel, and give leadership at a most desperate time. Who was it? It was Hannah's boy, Samuel. Do you get that? It was Hannah's boy, Samuel. Hannah's boy made a difference. Made a difference. Just let me read you chapter 3 and verse 19. The Lord was with Samuel as he grew up, and he let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, recognized that Samuel was attested as a prophet to the Lord. The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, and there he revealed himself to Samuel through his word. Didn't seem to do Samuel any harm, did it? Being sent away to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. He became a leader and a man whom God greatly used. So that's Hannah. That's the story of that mother. And may God just help us to seize on something that's been said today that's been for us and helpful and pertinent. So we can take it away with us as we go today. So mums, dads, thank you all very much indeed. We're going to sing, going to sing a song that's been chosen for us to sing. It'll be on the screen. It's in the book number 456.